Oh, hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Hey, did you know that Keiser Report on Espanol, the YouTube channel, gets more views than Rachel Maddow now? That's right. Hola! Stacy?
Actually, I want to signal ahead of time that we're going to be doing some journeying south of the border. We're going to be in Argentina, in Uruguay, Brazil, and a little bit in Colombia in December. And we'll be filming down there. You know, Argentina's currency just collapsed by over 25% in one day, just last week. And we're going to follow up on that. We're going to report from the scene and find out there. And early next year, we're going to go to Mexico City, and we're also going to be in Guadalajara. So we're doing our whole tour of Latin America.
That's going to be exciting. Maybe we'll do some special side interviews, post them to the YouTube channel for our Spanish-speaking audience that loves us to death.
Yes,
they love us. Well, maybe not to death. I don't, in Mexico City. Let's not go there.
And the thing is, of course, that the Mexicans and Colombians and Argentinians and Uruguayans, they all kind of have their own dialect and way of saying something. So it's going to be very confusing for you. But nevertheless, we're going to stay here in America for these headlines in this episode of Keiser Report. Human tragedy on the diseased streets of San Francisco. Worse than slums in Brazil and India. Of course, you could tell, we were recently in San Francisco talking about our travels, and we did walk across the city. Well, NBC News has done a study and actually spent some time going through 153 blocks of San Francisco, and what they found was pretty appalling. The NBC Bay Area Investigative Unit surveyed a section of downtown San Francisco to determine the amount of feces, hypodermic needles, and garbage littering the heart of the city. The results reveal a disgusting and potentially deadly mix of contamination that experts now believe could exceed some of the dirtiest slums in the world. And why they say that, by the way, is they talked to an infectious disease expert, Dr. Lee Riley. He's an infectious disease expert at the University of California, Berkeley. In places like Kenya and Brazil, at least in these slum dwellings, there are often long-term homes for families, and so there is an attempt to make the surroundings more livable. Homeless communities in San Francisco, however, are often kicked out from one part of town and forced to relocate to another. The result is extreme contamination.
All right, the human feces problem in San Francisco. It's quite prevalent, but the whole city, no matter where you are, smells like a human outhouse. And it's not a nice smell.
Yeah, and we're going to continue talking about this in the second half with Charles Hugh Smith, and he lives there actually in Berkeley. But he, this sort of bigger picture of what it is actually telling us, because it's very, very important that, we have this global social media, and that social media is filled with virtue signaling, and the virtue signaling is primarily coming from here in San Francisco. And so you're seeing that on one side, is you see this great, massive, very loud signaling of their virtue, and yet anybody who goes there and sees on the streets, you would say this is a city of people with no virtue.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Royal Court of Versailles. So they had no toilet facilities there, and the dukes and the aristocracy would just go behind a curtain in the middle of the ballroom and relieve themselves and leave a pile of human feces on the floor. And of course it stank. But of course they were virtue signaling because they were monarchs and aristocrats. So they felt like, well, it stinks and it's awful, but it has nothing to do with me. I'm the guy who just came out from behind the curtain. And in fact, I was just squatting there and leaving that human feces on. But don't look at me, because I'm like an aristocrat. So it's not me, right? So it's virtue signaling. So you have a new aristocracy in San Francisco of stock market manipulators and central bank beneficiaries who are stinking up the place like the Royal Court of Versailles and claiming, not me.
These are also the winners that Hillary Clinton talked about. These are the elite that we have. They run our media. They control at least the propaganda or perception that is spun about what America is. So in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in New York, for example, they will say that the vast majority of Americans between those two coasts are deplorable. And part of the reason why they're deplorable is that say they're anti-open borders, and they'll say, let's bring in everybody. And yet here they are, and they can't even take care of people right there in front of them who are forced to go through the indignity of using the street as a toilet rather than, I don't know, providing housing or providing more housing, because of course these are the NIMBY sort of people who don't want more housing in their area in order to keep their house prices up. So there becomes, at a certain point, it just becomes a false economy. Like everything is false, fake news, false economy, and everything.
It's cognitive dissonance, isn't
Yes.
it? They don't see the connection between, well, let's take everyone's money, let's bankrupt everybody, let's make everyone homeless. Oh, they're on the street defecating. Oh, geez, oh, how did that happen?
They themselves are perhaps projecting when they say, you people in Middle America are deplorable. Well, anybody from Middle America who traveled to San Francisco might say, these conditions are deplorable here.
Well, remember in 2008, Goldman Sachs was caught bagging bags of feces. Remember in the testimony, they admitted the fact that they were selling bags of feces as a multi-billion-dollar collateralized feces bond. You know, so they're used to it.
Yeah, that was in the testimony to the Senate about the CDOs, the collateralized debt obligations that they sold to pension funds. And in their internal communication, they knew that it was garbage, essentially, that they were selling to pension funds that then went broke. But in terms of this dried feces in the streets of San Francisco, it's important to know that this can lead to airborne diseases. If you do get stuck with these disposed needles, you can get HIV, hepatitis C, hepatitis B, and a variety of other viral diseases, said Dr. Lee Riley, an infectious disease expert at the University of California, Berkeley. He warned that once fecal matter dries, it can become airborne, releasing potentially dangerous viruses such as the rotavirus. If you happen to inhale that, it can also go into your intestine. The results can prove fatal, especially in children. So this is like the macabre situation that is emerging just so a few people can have on paper that their house price keeps going up. Is you have this situation where you might have, you might inhale some dried fecal matter and get sick and die.
Right, all the money that would be used to build infrastructure and to be societally beneficial has been stolen to jack up house prices. And the people who live in those houses are saying, we have got nothing to do with those people dying on the streets, even though they're probably the ones who will be inhaling the dried fecal matter and dying soon enough.
When you're in San Francisco, there is, on the other hand, a charm about it because there isn't much development. There are no Starbucks in many areas of, like North Beach area of San Francisco. So there is a still old world sort of quality to it. So they have kept out some development, and that has been good in one way. But on the other hand, if you're going to have this disaster that nobody wants to deal with, then I think it might be worse in the long run. So I want to then turn to the other coast, okay, the East Coast. Remember, these are the winners. They're not the deplorables that the Hillary sort of Democrats will say. This is a tweet about an article from Business Insider. Scary bleep. Newark now has some of the highest levels of lead in drinking water in the country. State records show lead levels of 52 parts per billion in Newark. This is more than 3 times the EPA threshold and greater than that in Flint, Michigan. Haven't we learned? New Jersey is 50% African American. Flint, Michigan is 57% African American. They both have contaminated water. Lead in your water does, basically cause brain development to be slower in children. So all these African American children are basically being poisoned with lead and setting back their progress into the future. And also note that the Business Insider story, their headline reads, "A water crisis outside New York City has surpassed Flint," according to a pediatrician who helped uncover the Flint disaster. That's how they refer to Newark, New Jersey. It's a city outside New York City. This is a very New York way to refer to any city that is not New York City.
Oh, right, like that famous New Yorker cover. Shows New York and then the rest of the country portrayed as a vanishing wasteland ending up nowhere. There's the Emerald City, New York City. That's the Oz. Everything else is worthless.
But actually is kind of telling in what this whole winter and deplorable situation that we have in America, and I think across Europe too, because we no longer have any fiscal, trade, or industrial policies. We only have monetary policy. So monetary policy always favors the cities and the cities that are closest to the money printers. New York City obviously is where the money printers are, and we have essentially the same out of San Francisco, where you have intellectual property and the copyright cartel as a way to print money and act as a toll booth around the whole entire world. So,
well, it's medieval. It's medieval, and so you have a situation where you have medieval diseases, as someone pointed out. We haven't seen typhus outbreaks in quite some time. And, you know, going back to medieval days, you had the church, which is like the monetarist of present-day 21st century, where they would discuss how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. They were in power, and they imposed this feudal model. And now we've got neo-feudalism, where we've got central bankers discussing how many derivatives can we stuff into a worthless pension fund. And we've got folks in San Francisco and Newark, New Jersey dying from medieval diseases. So this is neo-feudalism. This is the 21st century version of the Dark Ages. And we've got the aristocracy pooping in the middle of the road and claiming they got nothing to do with it.
Read the likes of Chaucer, and you'll see what the life for the ordinary peasant was very similar to what it is for people living in Newark or Flint, Michigan, or those who are not wealthy in San Francisco. You know, here I'm showing you that lead in the water is very, very harmful to the prospects of the children that you're literally ruining their brains, and you're disadvantaging them greatly. And here over in San Francisco, the children are also noted in this situation from the NBC News investigation, where they found in 153 blocks, they found 300 piles of feces in their journey around these 153 blocks, and 100 drug paraphernalia. But they, during their investigation, while they were walking around, they came across a teacher walking all these little 3-year-olds, you know, for their nursery school class, having to walk down the street. And the teacher explained, yeah, I have to teach the children not to go near these things that are on the street, these piles of feces. And they talked to a 3-year-old girl, NBC News, named Analia Reed. And she says, "The floor is dirty," a 3-year-old student at the preschool told us, who irately explained having to navigate dirty conditions on her walks to school. "There is poop in there," she exclaimed. "That makes me angry." San Francisco, it is like literally the center of the global tech world, and you have these sort of conditions, as you say, that are medieval. Like, what does that say about those people who live there, the people who run that city?
Cognitive dissonance. You know, they don't see any connection to it. They lord over these tech giants for being brainy in some way, but they've created this mess behind them.
Literally. And I want to say quickly, you know, before we wrap up, that it goes hand in hand with the 100-year bonds. The children, our future, like, we have no faith in our future. Like, that's gone. Like, there's no plan for the future. There's all this bad debt that's dumped there. These children have no hope with their living in these medieval conditions and lead in their water. That just shows real contempt for the future.
Right. You want to make $1 billion? Start selling wrongful birth insurance. All right. We'll be back right after the break. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Charles Hugh Smith of twominds.com, where you'll find his big ideas and brave thinking on economics and politics. His latest book is called Pathfinding Our Destiny. Charles Hugh Smith, welcome back.
Thank you, Max. It's always a pleasure.
All righty, let's talk about the gulag of the mind. You recently coined this phrase. What does it mean? What are the signs of it?
Well, Max, I think that's my way of trying to describe the prison that the vast majority of America seems to be caught up in. And it's what we believe to be true based on what we're told is true. And that narrative has so many holes that it's it's really an amazing moment in history that so many people are so deluded about economics and as well as politics and the global situation.
You know, Adam Curtis, who's a documentarian in the UK, made a film called Hypernormalization about how in the Soviet times, lies just became the common currency. No one expected anyone to tell the truth at any time. It seems like America's heading into a similar period, Charles.
Absolutely, and that is a very interesting documentary that fits right into this concept. And so what seems to be happening is that the narrative is being pushed harder and harder to levels that it becomes more outlandish and more absurd and more unbelievable. And yet the pressure on anybody who dissents, who says, well, I'm not so sure that's true, let's look at that, then you're immediately marginalized, vilified, and demonetized.
What is virtue signaling and why is it everywhere? What's the true meaning of this, Charles?
My understanding of it is instead of actually solving problems or proposing policies that deal with the difficult conflicts that we have, it's just a way of glossing that over by saying, I'm more virtuous than you are because I'm saying these virtuous things, like celebrate diversity and so on. And what the problem with virtue signaling is we have a broken economic and financial system, and that's going to start impacting our real world lives very shortly. And it already has under the surface for many Americans. And so we have to start dealing with problems, and just saying, well, I'm virtuous because I say virtuous things in public, that's not solving any problems.
Yeah, I noticed people with bumper stickers on their cars that say coexist or persist tend to be the worst drivers. I think that's a good example of virtue signaling. The actions are deplorable, to coin a phrase. Anyway, so San Francisco is the home of virtue signaling, apparently, and yet it has on its streets what is called a, quote, human tragedy, human feces and needles everywhere. Is there no greater demonstration of this virtue signaling than what we see in San Francisco, Charles? You're in San Francisco. Tell us about it.
Well, yes, I'm in the People's Republic of Berkeley, which sadly has now become more or less a corporate version of the old People's Republic of Berkeley. And everything is so expensive here. It's very similar to San Francisco, that only the wealthy or people with wealthy parents who are subsidizing their lifestyle can live here. And the solutions are pathetic. And the solutions are, well, let's build more public housing, and we need, like, say, 100,000 units, and we can build like 1,200 because each unit costs $400,000.
All right, so just for confirmation, since you're there on the ground, is this true? Is there human feces everywhere and needles and everything, or what is it hyperbole, or is this true?
There are a lot of neighborhoods with those problems, but if you're in the tourist areas of San Francisco, then all of that human tragedy is kept to a low boil. In other words, it's stuff is cleaned up around the big hotels and the big shopping malls and so on. But if you go out into the neighborhoods, then you're going to see that. And here in Berkeley, there's a homeless encampment a block away from our little abode here in central Berkeley, and there's various homeless encampments around, and the city's trying to deal with it by putting porta potties out there and so on. But they're here and they're permanent.
I was surprised to hear that this problem is now reaching into areas like Orange County, California. Famous people living there behind the so-called Orange Curtain. You know, it was a bastion of a certain class. Now they can't seem to escape. All their virtue signaling has not stopped this from encroaching on their homes now. So across the much of the fiat world, Charles, we see an infinite regress into more fiat. Right? All the fiat currencies refer to other fiat currencies, and we even see this kind of extending into other areas like that company Beyond Meat. This company sells fake meat, which many nutrients and nutritionalists will tell you is a toxic nightmare, but it trades at a higher stock market valuation than real companies, right? So the fake and the phony are overtaking the real. Your thoughts?
We can look to what's happening in the financial system for some dynamic, some explanation of why Beyond Meat and that kind of essentially worthless companies are valued in the billions is the central banks have pushed interest rates to zero, and now in many places into negative interest yields, right? Where you're actually, it's costing you money to put your cash in a bank. Well, this means the system is completely broken because capital is supposed to yield a return. It's supposed to earn a return. And so now capital can't earn a return, certainly not a safe return. So it's being pushed into extremely speculative markets. And what happens when all the capital is pushed into speculation, you get bubbles. Then central banks have to support and keep inflating the bubbles, because if the bubble pops, the whole financial system goes down the tubes. And so we see all this money sloshing around going into absurd companies like Beyond Meat, and the bubble is increasing, but it's going to pop it someday because you've created a system that's inherently unstable.
So the Roman Empire collapsed, as did the Spanish and British empires. The people living there seem fine today. Is the loss of empire something to fear, or should we welcome it?
That's a very interesting question that no one's ever asked me before. And I think if we look at the long cycles of history, we see that when the empire first collapses, it can collapse rather abruptly, like Rome, the Western Roman Empire did, or it can kind of decay over time like the Spanish and British empires. And if you have a decay phase, people can adjust over time, right, to a lower standard of living, less income, less trade, and so on. But if it's an abrupt change, which is more likely here in America, when the financial system does break, then people are really going to go through a tremendous psychic shock as well as an economic shock, because their standard of living is going to fall precipitously. And most people are not prepared for that eventuality.
Now let's talk about some local politics in your area. Andrew Yang, he is somebody that I identified a long time ago as being a potential dark horse in this race. And he's got his universal basic income idea, $1,000 a month. What are your thoughts on Andrew Yang and UBI, Charles?
I think Andrew Yang is about I've said before, he seems to be one of the few, if perhaps only candidate who actually seems to understand that the economy is changing at fundamental levels. In other words, the fourth industrial revolution, the automation of white-collar jobs instead of just blue-collar jobs, and so on. And so he's proposing UBI as the sort of Band-Aid for this. As you and Stacy have discussed in the past, my objection to UBI is not the idea of giving people money so much, but that our communities are falling apart. And so we actually would be better off paying people to do something useful and productive in their communities.
So in other words, it would be like a massive program like FDR did to put money to work with jobs, people building highways, people building stuff. What's interesting about the UBI concept, though, is that Andrew Yang, being an entrepreneur, it seems like he's taking the approach of America as enterprise, and that everyone in America gets their dividend. You get a monthly dividend, and he's going to restructure the economy away from money losers like the military and put that money to work in our enterprise dividend portfolio as Americans. So it'll incentivize all of America to work, in a different way. But anyway, that's my thought. Let's ask you about something else here. So, talking about this economy, there's roughly in the global economy now $15 trillion of these negative interest rate bonds. In my view, it's no difference between a negative interest rate bond and a default. Those two things are pari passu, as we used to say on Wall Street. What's your take on negative rate bonds? We've got about a minute.
I think you're absolutely right, Max, that it's a either or choice, that there's no way to support the mountain of debt that the world economy now has without lowering interest rates. And negative rates, of course, are designed to push everybody to spend whatever money they have to keep this kind of bogus debt-based economy afloat, right? And so that's the obvious incentive, and that's what all the central bankers talk about. We need to push people out of savings and make them spend every dime they have. And of course, that again is undermining the basis of capitalism, which is you take savings from income and you invest it in future growth of productivity, which should be broad-based, which, as you say, is Andrew Yang's idea. Let's broaden the base of capital, you know, instead of like letting it become more and more concentrated in the hands of the few. But to have negative interest rates means the system's broken. This is like the last gasp.
Fair enough. Charles Hugh Smith, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our very special guest, Charles Hugh Smith of twоminds.com. If you want to reach us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.